ranking member, Mr. Zeldin, for us to approach this in a bipartisan way, because if we look at our history, America's soft power, but America's diplomacy and development really has been incredibly important to how we've shaped the world, and I would argue that we've shaped the world for the better. I also, when I think about the members on this committee, both in the majority and the minority, you look at the quality of the membership, the number of veterans, including the ranking member, who currently, I believe, still serves in the reserves, bringing that experience, to have a senior diplomat like Mr. Malinowski, to have a refugee who understands that experience like Ms. Omar, and to have folks that either came here as immigrants or are children of immigrants, and I think that breadth of knowing what the American experience is, and hopefully we'll bring that spirit to who we are on this committee. And again, I couldn't be more honored to have the privilege of chairing what I think is going to be a very important committee on oversight. So.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and it's been a privilege over the course of the first couple months here of the new Congress with this new subcommittee. In conversations and meetings with the chair, I could certainly confirm his desire, his strong interest in bipartisanship. That certainly will result in a stronger product coming out of this committee. It helps empower the full committee, and I think bipartisanship is something for all of us to be very proud of. So thank you to Chairman Barra for setting the right tone. And with regards to his priorities coming out of the gate, I'm confident that at the end of this Congress, a couple years from now, a year and a half from now or so, we're going to be able to have real product, maybe in legislative form, maybe through oversight, that will help strengthen America. So I look forward to serving with you and all the other members of this committee, and I yield back.
So the hearing will come to order. This hearing, titled America's Global Leadership, Why Diplomacy and Development Matters, will focus on why the State Department and USAID are critical to the success of our country, our foreign policy, and how Congress can ensure that they thrive. Without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitations in the rules. I will now make my opening statement and then turn it over to the ranking member for his opening statement. Good afternoon. I want to welcome all the members to this first hearing of the Oversight and Investigations Committee. Chairman Engel reestablished this subcommittee to strengthen Congress's oversight of the executive branch and reassert our authority in foreign policy. This subcommittee will work closely with the full committee and other subcommittees to exercise our role. And as we heard this morning from Secretary Albright, it is her belief, and I think it is all of our belief as I listen to the questions and testimony of members on both sides, that foreign policy best is done in a bipartisan way. And that the best foreign policy at our best is when the executive branch is working closely with the legislative branch in partnership, sending a singular message to the world, so there's no ambiguity to our allies and others. And I think, as we mentioned earlier, that really is a goal, and I'd like to acknowledge the partnership that I think we'll have with the ranking member, Mr. Zeldin from New York. To begin with, as we look at Article 1, and again, Secretary Albright said now is the time for Article 1 to really reemerge. It really has far too long, under both Democratic and Republican administrations, Congress has allowed oversight to falter. And more of our ability really has shifted over to the executive branch, both under Democratic administrations and Republican administrations. And I think this is our opportunity to re-exert that oversight and start bringing things back to what we should be doing. With that, if I look at our history as the United States, particularly in the post-World War II history, as we looked at the 3 pillars of defense, but also diplomacy and development, our foreign policy and our approach to the rest of the world really did make the world a better place. And I know Mr. Natsios in his opening comments will talk about the Marshall Plan and the remarkable work that we did rebuilding Europe, rebuilding Japan, going and protecting Korea, and the miracle that is the Republic of Korea today. And would rightfully argue that our presence around the world, the American presence, leading with our values and leadership in the 70 years post-World War II, made the world a better place, made the world a safer place, made the world a more democratic place. But I think we can also, as we think about the purview of this committee over the next 2 years, we understand that the world has changed. It's a different place today. You see, it's not a given that the democratic model of our values will rule the 21st century. You see more autocratic leaderships, the rise of China, the reemergence of Russia. You also see, the failed states, the terrorist states that have to be approached in a very different way than we may have approached a Cold War with the nation state. And this is an opportune time for us to take a step back, take a deep dive into where America's diplomacy is today, where America's development is, but then also come out of this thinking about where we need to go. And this committee is Oversight and Investigations, and we will use the tools that we have available to investigate where we are today. But that would be only half the battle if we didn't actually try to come out and present to this administration or the next administration, and then this Secretary of State or the next Secretary of State, a roadmap of where we think we could go to continue to lead the world, both with our soft power and hard power. And again, there's no reason that this next century can't be an American century, because the last century certainly was an American century. And with that, I'd like to thank both Ms. Higginbottom and Mr. Natsios for joining us, and I will turn this over to my esteemed colleague, Mr. Zell, the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is the first hearing of the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations. I look forward to working with you on bipartisan priorities we both share. This hearing is certainly the first step. We both believe in American leadership and Congress's role in oversight and investigations. I wanted to extend my thanks to today's two witnesses for being here today to discuss the importance of American foreign policy, aid, and development around the world. There is no question that targeted and measured foreign aid and level-headed diplomacy further American national security, business, and humanitarian interests. Today, we are not here to question this consensus, but rather examine the tools and resources used in these endeavors in an effort to ensure they are the most effective and efficient means possible. Too often, we have witnessed programs with good intentions originally established to forward American values and improve the lives of those around the world go off the tracks. And it is our responsibility as the Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee to monitor these programs and help correct course when necessary. For example, and given the backgrounds of our two witnesses, and I'm here with Congressman Perry, who's joined us, I'll touch on the stated mission of the previously U.S. taxpayer-funded United Nations Relief and Works Agency, also known as UNRWA, which has a mission to provide humanitarian support for Palestinian refugees in Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and the West Bank and Gaza. The education of children, especially those in war-torn areas, is a noble mission. But over the past 6 years, UNRWA and the State Department have failed to provide Congress with an accurate picture to implement oversight measures by deliberately withholding information in certain reporting requirements, and we recently found out why. In a recently declassified portion of a GAO report, we learned that the textbooks in the educational program of UNRWA were delegitimizing Israel, and that supplementary material to counter this textbook content that promotes anti-Semitism paid for with American tax dollars was being rejected on the ground. The underlying mission of foreign aid programs like UNRWA is critical, but holding them to that mission and ensuring its funding goes to furthering that goal may be even more important. U.S. foreign aid should be an investment, building a strong foundation with our allies. However, providing economic assistance to the Palestinian Authority, which supports a pay-for-slay program to financially reward terrorists for killing innocent Americans and Israelis, is in direct violation of this ideology. Last Congress, the Taylor Force Act was passed and signed into law. It withholds economic assistance to the Palestinian Authority until it publicly condemns these acts of violence and stops inciting and rewarding the terrorists who perpetrate these horrific crimes, therefore protecting the innocent Americans and Israelis and better allocating these limited foreign aid resources. The United States must support aid programs that promote the interests of our nation and therefore of our allies. For example, foreign aid that promotes good governance in a country like Venezuela is a proud show of what an important investment this funding can be. There are so many different examples all across the entire map for the entire world that this committee can get into. Just touching on a couple of examples there, but I'm sure we'll hear a lot more over the course of today's testimony with our two great witnesses. There should be an integrated policy approach to aid and diplomacy in which we leverage greater influence per aid dollar. We must employ greater accurate oversight and accountability internally within the State Department, as well as over these foreign assistance programs, ensuring those utilizing U.S. funding are better aligned with our nation's values. We need to examine whether the millions of dollars we give to multilateral agencies serve our needs and whether they continue to maintain the high standards Americans would expect. We need to share the burden so that we can offer the opportunity for other regional actors to contribute as well. Are there administrative efficiencies we could implement to make our dollars go farther? How can we improve transparency and accountability in a manner that does not hinder development efforts? These are the questions I hope our witnesses will address. Thank you both again for being here, and I look forward to your statements. I would like to thank our subcommittee chairman, Mr. Barra, full committee chairman, Mr. Engel, and lead Republican, Mr. McCall, for their leadership and assistance on these issues. I yield back.
Thanks. I will now introduce the witnesses. As I stated earlier, Ms. Heather Higginbottom is the Chief Operating Officer of CARE USA, one of the world's largest humanitarian organizations. She served as Deputy Secretary of State for Management and Resources in the Obama administration. Andrew Natsios is currently the director of the Scowcroft Institute at Texas A&M. He served as the 13th administrator for the United States Agency for International Development. Thank you both for being here. And with that, Ms. Higginbottom.
Chairman Barra, Ranking Member Zeldin, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify as you work to make the State Department and USAID more effective and more efficient. I've edited my remarks for time and ask that my full statement be included in the record.
And without objection, your full statement, written statement, would be part of the record. Thank you for reminding me that I'm supposed to do that.
For the last 6 years, first as Deputy Secretary of State for Management and Resources, and currently as CARE Chief Operating Officer, I've had the privilege of seeing American diplomacy and development in action and the responsibility of thinking about how to strengthen it. With just about 1% of the federal budget, the United States gets no better return on its investment than the work of our diplomats and development professionals, which saves millions of lives, builds stronger economies, and creates a safer world. Mr. Chairman, I know that it has never been popular to invest money overseas. President Reagan acknowledged that, quote, foreign aid suffers from a lack of a domestic constituency. But the very DNA of CARE is a daily reminder that Americans have always stepped up to address global challenges. 73 years ago, a small group of Americans joined forces to create the first ever care packages for starving survivors of World War II. Today, instead of delivering aid in a box, CARE works to address the roots of poverty using proven tools to empower women and girls and help entire communities create long-term prosperity, stability, and resiliency. We're here today to focus on what we can do better, but we shouldn't lose sight of what the U.S. already does so well, and I saw it firsthand in 2014 as the Ebola outbreak in West Africa threatened whole countries. American leadership made the difference. Working with partners in a coordinated, rapid, innovative way, we brought every tool we had to bear, from deploying civilian health and development experts to engaging our military and Border Patrol agents. We worked with Congress to provide resources, pharmaceutical companies to develop a vaccine, manufacturing companies to make protection suits for health workers, and we galvanized partners to build an aircraft to evacuate patients with infectious diseases. As a result, Ebola was contained in West Africa. And in our interconnected world, where disease knows no boundaries, we should be building upon, not weakening, instruments of diplomacy and development. The U.S. is a catalytic leader, and what we do encourages other countries to act. And it's why, over the past 25 years, the number of people worldwide living in extreme poverty has been halved, as has the number of women dying during pregnancy and the number of children dying before their 5th birthday. And this has been a bipartisan effort across Republican and Democratic administrations. Despite these clear results, the President's budgets for FY18 and 19, and we fear once again in FY20, have proposed slashing foreign assistance by 30%, jeopardizing countless life-saving programs. We appreciate that Congress has rejected these cuts, but there has been damage done due to uncertain funding levels and timelines, the threat of rescissions packages, and government shutdowns. Just earlier this month, we came days away from halting a Food for Peace program in Haiti that supports 100,000 chronically poor households. We're very grateful to our USAID colleagues who managed to release funds at the 11th hour, but when lives are on the line, we cannot afford crises of our own making. To be sure, the State Department and USAID are not perfect institutions. The 2015 Quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Review, which I oversaw, contains many recommendations to make these institutions more efficient and more effective. I'll highlight just three. First, the currency of the State Department is information and relationships, and yet there is no enterprise-wide system for organizing, collecting, and sharing information. Second, better utilization and expertise in data analytics, science, and technology is essential. And the siloed natures of both the State Department and USAID mean that cross-cutting analysis and engagement is often unavailable. Third, performance management and strategic planning at both agencies should be strengthened, and collaboration and communication across agencies should be enhanced. As the history of the care package shows, often the best way to combat fragility, address poverty, and prevent mass displacement is by harnessing the generosity and talents of the American people in partnership with communities around the world. This work, backed by continued American engagement in diplomacy and development, is essential to building a future worth having for ourselves, our children, and our neighbors around the world. Thank you very much, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, and members of the committee. I want to thank you for the opportunity to speak today on the importance of foreign aid programs. My comments today are my own. I'm not representing the Bush School of Government and Public Service at A&M. You could say I'm representing the Scowcroft Institute, a little institute within the school, named after General Scowcroft, who is our founder. Since World War II, the United States foreign aid programs have played a leading role improving the livelihoods of the world's poor and cultivating good governance, democratic practice, protecting human rights, and accelerating economic growth. I've said this before in public, and people are taken aback when I say it. We are living through the greatest golden age in civilized history for the common people of the world. And the reason I say that is the statistic that my colleague here just mentioned. There has been a dramatic improvement in the lives of the poor, and that was most people in the developing world. 90% of the population 100 years ago in the developing world were poor. There wasn't even the developing world. There were colonial empires 100 years ago. But that has dramatically shifted. The number of poor people has dramatically shifted. The number of democracies until recently has been on the rise. And while there have been terrible abuses of human rights, believe me, I'm in the center of the Rwandan genocide. I was there when Darfur took place. And I like to think we blew the whistle in AID on what was happening before anyone else even noticed it was going on. But the fact is that people didn't even know what human rights were 100 years ago. They didn't even use those words. And there are no institutions protecting human rights. So we've made enormous progress, and we're living through it, and we don't see the forest from the trees. We don't see what things were like 200 years ago or 300 years ago, when life expectancy at 40 years old was regarded as long. The Marshall Plan was our first organized, systematic effort to extend American humanitarian power abroad in a permanent way. Herbert Hoover ran the greatest food aid program in world history during World War I and the immediate aftermath, but it was a temporary thing. And by the way, he also went into Russia in the middle of the great famine after Lenin took over. And it's a very interesting story to see how he prevented the central government from manipulating the food aid. Then, the same problems we have now with the manipulation of aid took place in Russia in the early 1920s. And Hoover simply told Lenin, we're leaving the country if you do not stop interfering. We are not distributing food on a political basis. It will only be done based on need. And that is one of the hallmarks of our aid programs, particularly in humanitarian assistance and in health programs. We distribute aid based on need. Now, I understand some aid has to be distributed to our allies, economic aid, that sort of thing. We understand that. But when it comes to the survival of people, of women and children, of non-combatants, we need to focus on aid distributed based on need, not based on interest. We helped win the Cold War more than most people realize in AID. I think the role of aid, for example, in South Korea, there are amusing stories as to how intrusive AID was in the Park government in terms of forcing them to make reforms. We know, and the same thing happened in Taiwan, in Indonesia, in Thailand, in Greece, where my ancestors are from, in Turkey, in the earlier days, in the early 1950s, when Stalin was destabilizing both countries in the late 40s. We have had remarkable successes where countries that were extremely poor are now first world countries. In Latin America, in Asia, and we're beginning to have them in Africa now. So one of the greatest success stories, my favorite, is the Green Revolution. And that was an effort by Dr. Norman Borlaug, who's a professor at Texas A&M. And later in his life, we have a Borlaug Institute there. And that institute was Dr. Borlaug for the Green Revolution, which doubled yields in Asia. And at the same time that Mao was killing 45 million Chinese from the Great Leap Famine, we were increasing yields and dramatically ending famine in Asia. In fact, a study has been done. The book's called Mass Starvation by Alex DeWall. It came out last year. He's a good friend of mine, teaches at Tufts, and he said, since 1980, with the creation of the International Humanitarian Response System, there's been a massive decline in the number of famine deaths. He traced them from 1870 till now. So we have empirical evidence showing that starvation deaths and famines have massively declined because of this international system that has been set up. Now, I've mentioned in my paper 4 challenges, which I'm running out of time now, so I can't go into: the forced displacement crisis, the pandemic disease risk, the risk of fragile and failing states, and food price volatility that is a major factor in the uprisings in the Arab world. People said it was the Arab Spring. It was not a spring. It's been a nightmare in Syria and Yemen in particular, and also in Libya. So, but there's a direct connection between food price increases that make people hungry, people can't afford the food, and political uprisings. The evidence, empirical evidence from political scientists and scholars is very convincing that there's a direct relationship. The 3 things I propose in my testimony at the end that we need to do in a broad sense is, first, decentralize power back to the missions. The reason we were successful in the Cold War is the mission directors, and I might add our ambassadors, had far greater discretion to carry out policies and programs in the embassies, in the country level, than we do now. Everything's been centralized over the last 30, 40 years, and it's not helping things because we in Washington are separated from the reality of what's going on in these countries. 2, we need to deregulate AID. AID is overburdened with the regulatory burden that's been imposed on it in order supposedly to reduce abuse. I might add, it doesn't reduce abuse. It's just a huge amount of paperwork. The abuse still takes place anyway, and it costs a lot of money. The third is that we need to consolidate. I think having aid programs at 18 different federal agencies is very unwise. And so those are the 3 reforms that I propose at the end of the paper. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Obviously, you've got a lot to say there, and all of it really important. I'll go ahead and start the questioning. You know, Ms. Higginbottom, and let me frame it this way. You know, I think it is incredibly important for us to recognize our veterans every day and have a day like Veterans Day to just remind us of what they do to protect our freedoms and represent us around the world and the sacrifice that they and their families make. But I do think far too often we forget about the others that are out there representing us, from our diplomats to our aid workers to the folks that are working through the NGOs. And I just want to make sure that we don't lose sight of that. And our generals are the first ones to admit that partnership that they have with the development community and the diplomatic community is incredibly important, because it is this combination of our hard power and our soft power. You've been inside the building at State Department and certainly have looked at how the department's working currently. And you know, if you would just make a few comments on, as we get this committee underway, some of the things that we should be thinking about and how we best could work with the folks inside the building.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think that this committee can play a really important role at highlighting some of the challenges that both the Foreign Service and the Civil Service at State face, as well as to understand, to your point, Ranking Member, about how to have oversight of program and ensure we have accountability and that we have the right processes in place for those things. With respect to some broad areas that I think are important for the committee to consider, you know, we're seeing a decrease in the number of people taking the Foreign Service exam, and we're seeing some attrition. The building is built on the professional nature of its Foreign and Civil Service employees. I think it's really important that we understand what's happening there. We need the best and brightest to represent us around the world, and that's really critical. I mentioned in my testimony something that I'm really seized of, and I want to just mention it again, and that is that we don't have an enterprise-wide knowledge management system, and it is inefficient and ineffective to have a personnel system that is contingent upon rotations with no clear way of maintaining information and relationships that's organized and centrally housed. I think that's a critical issue. It takes investment and it's complicated, but I think it's really, really necessary.
Great, thank you. Mr. Natsios, you were a long-serving USAID director and certainly served at a very interesting time. As you think about your lessons and as you think about where we need to go in aid and development, you know, we are seeing other governments, you know, taking a different approach. The Chinese, for one, you know, certainly how they're approaching the rest of the world. What would, if you were to just imagine the absence of the U.S. presence there, who is going to fill that? And then the flip side is the importance of how should we be thinking about this as we go forward, as we think about aid and development in the 21st century, and the importance of the U.S.'s role in that capacity and what it says to the rest of the world when the United States shows up.
Well, I can tell you, number one, I'm a very strong internationalist. I'm right of center rather than left of center, but that's where the bipartisan nature of this coalition is. There are conservative internationalists and there are liberal internationalists, and I think we agree on more than we disagree, frankly. Mr. Guterres, the Secretary General of the UN, publicly said something we all knew privately. The UN does not work without American leadership. It doesn't. This is not well known. I guess the constituency of my party would not be too pleased. He had a weekly call with Kofi Annan for an hour every single week. He'd sit there and go through a list of things we needed done, and Kofi would say, we need help on this, and they weren't the best of friends, I have to tell you. They disagreed on stuff, but they worked together on a regular, systematic basis, and it made a difference. That relationship is weaker now, and it's been weakening for some time, and it's not a good thing. In Africa, my African friends who are, and I'm an Africanist, that's where I spent a lot of my time, tell me that African states that sign these infrastructure agreements with the Chinese are kicking themselves, saying we never read the fine print in the appendixes at the back. And I said, well, I think I know what you mean. You need to tell me what you mean. He said, the financing says if we can't pay the bill, they're taking out over our ports. I think it was in Zambia, recently. They're taking over one of the copper mines, or I can't remember what the project was, a huge infrastructure project. And so we don't do things like that. The United States, everybody knows we protect our interests, but we have other interests, and they are the broader development of the world. It's in our interest to have a stable world order where fewer people are poor. No one thinks that the Chinese have that anywhere in their foreign policy. So if the Chinese displace us, which I don't think they're going to do, I think this notion the Chinese are going to take over the system is nonsense. It's not going to happen for a variety of reasons beyond this hearing. But if it should happen, the international system will not be functional.
Well, in my sense, having traveled a lot and talked to leaders around the world, is they'd much rather the U.S. presence be there, because they know, obviously we have our interests, but we do act in a much more benevolent way in helping build the capacity of the countries that we're involved in. In my remaining time, Ms. Higginbotham, you're now at CARE International, and as we think about our role in diplomacy, but more importantly, aid and development, how should we be thinking about our partnership with the NGO sector and also potentially with the corporate sector?
Well, I think in the NGO sector, we look at across the spectrum at partnerships. That's how we work, whether it's with USAID or with private sector companies, with other INGOs. And I think as we see the world changing, and in particular the development landscape changing, what we see is that official development assistance, as critical as it is a very small percentage of private revenue flows that are going into countries. And that means if we're going to be really effective with our work, we have to look across a whole range of partnerships. And I think as we look at state and aid, ensuring they have the capacity, both agencies, to develop those partnerships and relationships and work more seamlessly across different sectors, I think will be much more effective and efficient with our resources.
Well, maybe expanding on that then as well, knowing that we have limited resources, and we certainly have challenges that we'll have to look at here domestically, I think, again, my perception is it won't be the United States going it alone. We now have multiple allies that are developed nations and so forth, and the President isn't incorrect that we should be working with that. Maybe Mr. Natsios or Ms. Higginbottom, how do you envision us working with the international community? And again, let me couch, I think the Americans should be leading because of our leadership and our values, but what's changed from the 20th century to the 21st century?
I think when systems political systems, democratic systems in particular, but even dictatorships, get under severe stress, they begin to behave differently. And it's not just in the United States this has been happening. It's happening across the world in other democracies. You're seeing what's happening in Europe right now. The Democratic Party of Sweden, I said, well, it's good, it's Democratic Party. It's actually the Nazi Party of Sweden from the 1930s. Got 17% of the vote in the last Swedish election in Sweden. That's very disturbing. And someone says, well, that's what they were before they've evolved. The Auditor General, which is a big job in this party, was a member of the Waffen-SS. He's an old man, but he was a member of the Waffen-SS, one of the most horrendous parts of Hitler's structure of terror. This party received 17% of the vote in Sweden over the immigrant issue in Europe. So it is an issue. These issues are churning across the world. We interviewed someone at the Bush School to teach, to go to become a student, and she told me, this is from Chile, she works in refugee issues. I said, what do you mean refugee issues? In Chile, 1 million refugees have moved to Chile, 1 million. And so it's having an effect across the world, and that's when people start turning inward, becoming more protectionist, more ultranationalist, more isolationist, and that's not good.
Mr. Nazi, so you notice that votes have gotten called. Mr. Zeldin, I think you can probably do your questions, and then we will recess and come back after votes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Earlier in my opening remarks, I referenced the GAO report that Congressman Perry and I recently secured the declassification of, revealed a number of concerning issues regarding staff who failed to implement appropriate policies and push back with the host country. When UNRWA developed complementary teaching materials and seminars to address concerning content following 3 textbook reviews, some staff refused to attend training and workshops and utilized as supplementary material, which countered the content that was not aligned with U.S. values and in many cases not aligned with reality. I want to ask you this question more generally. It's not specific to that report, but based on your experience, how did you deal with local beneficiaries who did not implement appropriate standards?
Well, Congressman, I hesitate saying this, but we're in Congress, but I'll say it. It's not this committee. It's not the 2 authorizing and appropriating committees. I will not mention the committees that are the problem. This Congress and other committees have placed draconian limits on American diplomats and aid officers getting out, not just of the capital city. They can't even get out of the mission. The aid mission in Kabul is called the prison by the aid staff. You can go for 2 years on duty, 1 year, in Kabul and never leave the mission. They won't let you out because of the security restrictions.
Just so you know, the question, though, is with
the question is, how do you monitor programs if you can't go out and see them? If you want to improve accountability, you need to get all of the authority over our embassies and missions out of those other committees, because they've told everyone no risk. No, then we shouldn't have embassies. We shouldn't have missions around the world. You have to get out of the capital city out of the mission and out of the embassy to find out what's going on. These abuses are taking place because we can't see what's going on. Why? Because of these security restrictions. And more importantly, they are restricting how many aid officers and diplomats can be assigned into these countries. So we hire more foreign service officers, and then we can't send them out to the field. And it's not, I used to blame the State Department for it until I became a diplomat and realized it's not the State Department's the problem. It's the committees, and it's not the 4 committees that oversee foreign affairs. I know the committees that are the problem. And they're giving exactly opposite instructions than all of you are giving to the State Department and AID. And that's the problem. Multiple conflicting instructions in terms of access and openness to get out of the capital city and the mission and the embassy.
Ms. Higginbottom, if you could, I guess, just speak to the interaction with the locals based on your experience. What else can we improve upon?
I do. I just want to agree with what Mr. Nazio said. The issue of how we manage risk, not how we eliminate it, has got to be taken up, and I think this committee can play an important role, because a lot of the concern we'd have about program implementation would be the limit that we would have imposed for mobility and not having the ability to really know what's happening in a given program. When you do know that there are a lot of mechanisms, I think, actually, to deal with staff that aren't following policy or guidelines, and when it's very clearly the case, then the line management has a lot of tools at their disposal to take action, and they should. The inspector generals at both agencies play an important role. I met with our inspector general every week. It was not my favorite meeting, but it was really important. And I think they can highlight critical areas where we need to focus and where there are problems. They do inspections of embassies. They can highlight some of these issues. So I think there are tools. I do think the risk issue is really important, and I do think that this committee can play an important role in helping to address that.
Okay, so I'm going to just continue based off of your answers, as opposed to I had a couple of other follow-up questions. But I guess going back to Mr. Natsios, can you now take your point, I guess, to the next level, a little more? Is there more specificity you can share? I know you weren't naming the other committees, but what can we get out of your exchange that we can act on?
Well, you can't reassign responsibility within the congressional system. There'd be a civil war if you did that. But if I had my way, the only 4 committees that would be allowed to deal with the State Department and AID would be the 4 appropriators and the authorizers, the 4 committees in the House and the Senate. I have to say, even though I've had disagreements over the years, I've never seen them do things that are damaging to either institution. But I have seen other committees in this Congress who don't travel. They do not know what's going on in the world, and their objective is not the carrying out of American foreign policy or aid programs. And it has nothing to do with party. The Democrats and the Republicans are equally damaging to the operational capacity. I wrote an article for the Weekly Standard about, I don't know, 10, 20 years ago, called Fortress Embassy America. Colin Powell this is after I retired from AID, got very upset with me. I said, Mr. Secretary, I am not criticizing you. You tried to open the embassies up, but the committee won't allow you to do it. And that's exactly correct.
Well, we all have more to talk about. I know that I'm going to yield back to the chair at this time, because I know we only have a few minutes left of votes.
This time the subcommittee will recess so that members can vote, and then the hearing will resume immediately following the votes. Thank you. I know Mr. Natsios has a flight, so in the interest of making sure you get home safely and don't have to rush, as someone who worries about being at the airport on time and has missed one too many flights, let's go and gavel back in. The committee will come to order. I ask the, at this juncture, Mr. Perry from Pennsylvania. So we'll go to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate coming directly. Oh, well, do you want to defer to the?
Okay. Thank you for that. See, we're already acting in a bipartisan manner. Congenial, working together. What a tone. Mr. Malinowski.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for your testimony earlier today and for your patience with us as we vote. Let me start with this question to you, Mr. Natsios. As a general matter, I assume you would agree that when the United States military deploys to a complicated, dangerous place, it is helpful to have civilian agencies involved as well, providing humanitarian assistance, development, reconstruction, good governance, and all of that. I presume we're in agreement, yes. And Ms. Higginbottom, okay. Let me apply that principle then to a situation we're dealing with right now, and that is Syria. A number of us, on a very bipartisan basis, over the last few weeks and the last few days, including at the Munich conference, made an effort to try to persuade President Trump not to follow through on his policy or tweet or whatever it was to pull all of our forces out of that country prematurely before the mission was complete. And he heard us, and I think, fortunately, made the decision to retain around 400 troops with our allies as part of the effort in that country. But what has been lost in the debate over our presence in Syria is that late last year, the administration also made a decision to completely end, not to spend some $230 million that the Congress had provided for stabilization programs in Syria because they argued others, particularly the Saudis, could fill our shoes. So I wanted to ask you, you think that's a good idea if we have 400 troops or any number of troops deployed in Syria to have absolutely no civilian component to that mission?
Well, there's another question before I say that. Congressman, I'm not sure this is appropriate to say, but I was the co-chairman of the Committee on Human Rights in North Korea with my good friend Roberta Cohen when you were Assistant Secretary at State, and you were our biggest supporter in giving grant money for investigating the outrageous atrocities that the North Korean regime has committed against its own people. And I do want to thank you for that.
Thank you.
It made a very great difference to us. We're a small organization, and we appreciate it. Thank you. So the first thing is, it's not how much money you spend, it's who's spending it and how it's spent. AID has expertise in war zones that even our friends in Europe, and I think some of our friends in Europe do some things very well. We, because of perhaps being a great power, we have mastered, not completely, how you work in very difficult places and get stuff done. Turning it over to the Saudis, they have no experience in this. They don't have any experience even in stable environments. So that's number one. It's not going to work with the Saudis taking it over. Two, I think if we're going to keep troops on the ground, we need to have a civilian component next to them. So I frankly do not support the withdrawal of these troops from Syria. I think we're going to have to send them back in again, potentially. And the question is, I know we keep telling the Russians and the Iranians they are going to fund the reconstruction. But if you don't do something to reconstruct the country, and I have to say the Russians do not have a lot of experience doing reconstruction work in the developing world, and the Iranians have no experience.
Right. Well, we are keeping them. So we are actually keeping the troops. With
I know, but what about the civilian component?
No, nothing. It's been completely eliminated. And I mean, does that make our troops safer? I mean, is there an issue potentially with, in terms of the safety of our troops, if there are no civilian eyes or ears, if we're not working with local governments, if we're not working with NGOs on the ground to counter extremism, which we were doing? We were funding in Syria these extraordinary women-led human rights organizations that operated under ISIS control, and in my view were the most effective counterweight to ISIS at a time when, well, they were obviously risking their lives. Would the Saudis fund those kinds of organizations, do you think, if we turned it over to them?
I wouldn't expect that they would, and I agree that, Congressman, that the type of relationships and engagements that you have with some civilian capacity in a context like that is really important. And I do think it can have a direct contribution to the security of the troops. I'm pleased to see that there's been a shift in that posture from the president.
Thanks. And just finally, a comment on a different issue that's come up: our assistance in Palestinian areas. And I take the point about criticism of UNRWA, but let's also not forget that we have completely eliminated USAID programs operating to improve water systems, to encourage Palestinian and Israeli children to get to know each other, to support schools. Presumably you don't think USAID was teaching people to delegitimize Israel. Who do you think benefits more from the complete elimination of those programs, Israel or Hamas?
I think eliminating the programs helps Hamas. That's not what the intention was by the administration, but that is what the effect is. I can tell you from personal experience, and I might add a little story. When we went into Afghanistan, the first thing we did, not just to educate kids, but to get them off the streets into school, was to print 7 million textbooks from the old royal curriculum when the king was in power that were at the University of Nebraska. Their archive was there from Afghanistan. I had 9 Afghan intellectuals, journalists, women's groups, academics read all 200 textbooks to make sure there was no anti-Semitic, or for that matter, anti-Russian, because they had anti-Russian stuff there because of the Civil War. And they had scratched out women, stick figures from all the textbooks. We put all that stuff back in, and I had them read it twice to make sure we didn't miss anything. And so there is a utility in having AID there because we're sensitive to these issues. And without us there, I think, frankly, you're going to give the extremists more license. So I understand the pressure of politics. I was in the legislature in Massachusetts for 12 years, but I think it's unwise to shut these programs down. I'm sorry, that's my experience.
Thank you. Fully agree.
Thank you, Mr. Malinowski. And Mr. Perry from Pennsylvania.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for being here. These foreign assistance dollars are precious, and of course, I don't need to tell you or remind you, they come from the hardworking taxpayers of the 10th District in Pennsylvania and everybody else's district here too. So it's really important that we safeguard them. And oversight's important, and I'm sure you're familiar with the stories of fraud and abuse. And so this is the Oversight Committee. I think it's important to highlight some of these things and then just have a discussion about it. There's a 2018 report that assistance provided to Afghanistan through the Reconstruction Trust Fund was at risk for misuse. The Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, who was appointed by Congress, stated that once the U.S. or any other donor provided its contributions to the fund, neither the World Bank nor USAID could account for how those funds were specifically spent. There's also, this goes back a way, but, because Mr. Natsios, I've listened to some of your comments, and also Mrs. Higginbottom, I want to get to some of those about why this is happening if you're not able to monitor correctly. But this goes back to 2013. An investigation by the Wall Street Journal found that more than 20% of the malaria drugs sent to Africa under the President's Malaria Initiative were stolen or diverted each year and then sold on the black market. Is the circumstance that you've described where the risk assessment or the aversion to risk is so great that we're not letting the people that would oversee, the staff that oversee these funds and these programs, is that something fairly new? Is that let's be candid, is that the advent of this administration, or does it go prior to this administration?
Oh, no. This goes back 20 years. This goes back to the embassy bombings in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam in the 1990s. I wrote an article, as I said, for a Weekly Standard called Embassy Fortress America. In the 1990s I wrote that. Oh, no, it was after I left AID. I'm sorry, it was in 2005. But it was based on what had happened earlier. This is not new at all.
So,
and it's not just, this is not just in Afghanistan and Iraq. This is across the world.
Across the spectrum. So when the IG does inspections and finds these these flaws and the lost money, so to speak, or the evidence of lost money, do they include in their report the circumstances, and why is that? Do you know?
I have to tell you, I'm sorry, I'm being very candid here. I'm not in office anymore. I'm not going to run for office, so I'll be very candid with you. The special IG for Afghan reconstruction is outrageous in some of the accusations he makes. For example, I'll give you an example. He said, we went to an AID-sponsored school that they rebuilt. There was no one in the school. That's true. You know why there was no one in the school? Taliban took out the headmaster and beheaded him in front of all the teachers and the children. If your child watched the headmaster would you send your child back to the school? Of course the school was empty. He didn't mention that in the audit, however. In fact, their people didn't even go to see. They sent someone else from one of the ministries to go in. Half of his staff has never even been to Afghanistan. I think I think the regulators are out of control. And I say that carefully. They're not doing, the IG for AID, in my view, does very good work. But he has to be in competition to see if he can find more abuse than the IG, the special IG. They compete with each other. And if he doesn't show that he's saving money, his budget gets cut by the Congress. I wrote an article about this called The Clash of the Counter-Bureaucracy in Development. I wrote it 10 years ago. You can get it for free right on the website of the CGD. I would urge you, I know it's a long article, but your staff could read it, the consequences of these systems that have been set up. When you have competing IGs to see who can find more stuff and exaggerate more abuse, you get inaccurate reporting. Are there problems? Absolutely. But you know, half the problems that I've seen, they never get reported by the IG because they never discover them.
If I could just add just very briefly, I think that as USAID and state to a certain extent have come up with new ways to try to monitor when they're limited in access, particularly in places like Afghanistan, questioning the efficacy of those frameworks, I think, is worthwhile because they are really committed to ensuring that the programs that are being funded work and that they aren't subject to fraud. But I think there's a good conversation to have to see whether that oversight the accountability framework that USAID and state are doing is effective. And I do think that the risk issue is more acute in some places than others, but post-Benghazi, it's been more constrained.
Sure. So what is if we're not, you know, look, these are all policymakers up here interested in making sure that you have the resources that you need, that American foreign policy and interests are furthered, and that's what we're doing here. And we count on things like the IG, right? I mean, that's what we're supposed to do. We're not there, and they are allegedly. So what is the mechanism for people inside? And thanks for the indulgence, Mr. Chairman. Inside the organizations, what is the internal mechanism? Is there an internal mechanism? When you said, you know, they're not reporting on half the things that you saw that apparently you found problematic at some level. Is there a mechanism for you to find a way to report and make sure the right thing is done?
What the IG does not say in AID, I used to meet with the IG every week. We had a very good relationship. When I saw something wrong, I tell them, I want you to go in and find out what's going on here. I found this on one of my field trips. I used to spend 25% of my time out looking at the projects in the field. And when the aid administrator goes out and says, I want to go out, you can't say no, there's a security problem. So the standard practice is, because there are two functions of the IG. One is to make sure the management systems work properly, and they do financial audits. And that is sacrosanct. We can't touch that. The other thing that they do is they look into fraud and abuse, which is a different function. It's in the same rubric of the IG. Most of the things that the IG investigates, AID officers report. That's how it works. The IG doesn't discover the abuse. We discover the abuse. We call in the IG. I can give you a lot of examples. Some of them entertaining, some of them very disturbing. But the staff calls up the IG, because that's the standard procedure in aid. If you discover something wrong and you don't report it, you can get fired for not reporting it.
Mr. Perry, if I can also interject. I would like that to be part of our role as congressional oversight as well. You know, as we're authorizing and appropriating funds for programs, I do think it is part of our responsibility to say, are these programs actually working the way they are? Are we using the taxpayer dollars in the most effective way? And you know, if programs are working really well in one part of the world, you know, certainly thinking about how you take that. And you know, if programs are not working or funds are not being used the way we intended them to be used as Congress, I also think it is our responsibility to expose that. And
without a doubt, and I appreciate the chairman's indulgence, and for the purposes of the discussion, it seems to me that there's a somewhat of a breakdown in the system here, and maybe, you know, while we rely on the IG as well, is there any way to reconcile between what the folks that work for the agency report to the IG and what the IG reports to us, right? I mean,
there's a difference between the special IG for Iraq reconstruction, and he was more responsible than the one in Afghanistan, in my view. I work with a guy, and I sent the IG into Iraq when the Marines took the city. The IG and the aid officers were right behind me, right behind them. The mission director called me up and he said, Andrew, could you have given me a month to set the systems up before you send the IG in? I said, I don't want any problems. And we had one contract that got screwed up. Guess where the contract was? The Air Force. We asked the Air Force auditors to look at it. It was a corrupt contract. We had to dump the whole thing. That's the only contract that got screwed up.
well, as two Army guys, look, we like picking on the Air Force, but that's another. All right, Mr.
I'm
Chairman.
Army too, or I wouldn't have told you the story.
Well, I know Mr. Espilot's on his way over here, and you know, I've got additional questions. So since we do have a little bit of time, we'll go ahead and do a second round of questions if you also have questions. I'm conscious and supportive of what Mr. Perry brought up in terms of, you know, we do have a responsibility to use the taxpayer dollars in the most effective way. And, you know, in conversation with the current USAID Administrator, Ambassador Green, I really do think the shift to capacity building and looking at the assets in the countries that we're going into and trying to, as opposed to a one-size-fits-all, saying, you know, each country and each situation is specific. Ms. Higginbottom, we had a chance to travel together to Europe, and you know, I think there's some specific examples of how CARE, working with USAID and the U.S. government, are doing some specific programs to help empower women and villages to care for themselves. And if you want to share some of those, you know, because those are not ones that demand donations from the United States in the long term. What it is doing is building self-sufficiency.
Yes, thank you. A lot of the CARE programming is really aimed at how we build capacity over time, how we make sustained investments. I mean, we do humanitarian response, we respond to emergencies, but we also look at investments we can make that can really lift up communities. And we do that with a lot of USG support, with a lot of resources from USAID as well as other partners. And we have a variety of different programs. We saw some in Sierra Leone, and the idea, and I think it's consistent with Administrator Green's approach to get a path to self-reliance, we want to lift whole communities out. And one of the reasons why, the principal reason why we have over time come to focus on women and girls is that the data shows that by targeting not just women and girls, we benefit boys and men as well, but by targeting them, we see that there are greater returns in terms of investment in healthcare and education for their children, and it lifts them up into becoming entrepreneurs. We have an incredibly powerful, it's called the Village Savings and Loan Association. They're called small savings groups, but they're much more than that. They become really a platform to save some money, but also to become empowered in communities and make permanent and sustained change. I think that's the type of development assistance that we know is successful and that works, and that over time should become really the lever that lifts these countries. Mr. Natsios was talking earlier about countries that were once the recipient of aid and are now our largest trading partners, some of the biggest countries in the world. That's our objective with the approach on poverty reduction.
Mr. Natsios, you know, in the remaining time that I have left, your focus on Africa, and when we think about, you know, there's many things that we should be focused on in Africa. You know, one that I spend a lot of time worried about is the youth bulge that we're seeing in sub-Saharan Africa, and you know, a large population of young people, young men who may not have anything to do, you know, potentially destabilizing to the region, et cetera. And I'd just be curious if we were thinking about how we approach that and how we are approaching it, and again, sticking with what's working, what's not working, Just in the remaining minute and a half, I'd be curious about your thoughts on that.
Well, first, when I became administrator, one of the first things we did was set up the Office of Conflict Mitigation and Management, and some people said, well, why? That's the State Department's job. I said, diplomatically it is. Developmentally, we can do things that cause conflict if we aren't careful. And we can do things that prevent conflict if we're careful as well in our planning. So we asked the missions, how many missions of the 80 missions have had civil wars or major conflicts in the preceding 5 years? 60%. 60% had major conflicts. I said, why don't you integrate into the plan to deal with that? And they said, well, how would we do that? That's why we set up this office. And the research showed that the youth bulge has a correlation and also a literacy. The young men who join these militias in West Africa, in Yemen and other places, almost all of there's a correlation between illiteracy and young men and unemployment, and young men joining these militias, which are basically criminal gangs in many of these countries. So the youth bulge is affecting the stability of the world order, even if we don't see it. It's at the grassroots level. And we begin to study what is causing this. It's very interesting. We sent teams in with the State Department and DOD in 2003 into the Sahelian region to see why people were joining Al-Qaeda. I think it's called Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb now. I don't know what it was called then. And they started interviewing young men. It was not poverty that was causing it. It was a sense of belongingness, of purpose in life. And most of them were not Islamists, rather. They had no theological training. They didn't even know what that meant. They were being propagandized by the leaders who were using them for this purpose. But it's the same mentality for young people, young men particularly, but young women now are doing it, joining gangs in LA or other places, and that are joining them in Central America. So what we've noticed is, if you can get these vulnerable young people into youth groups, more soccer teams. I mean, when I first saw this, I said, why are we spending money on soccer teams? He said, you want them joining the militias or soccer team? I said, soccer team. Great. So there is a relationship between, and you'll notice in the aid RFA, where they're advertising things, workforce planning for youth is now a much bigger theme in all of aid programming. I've noticed it much more than when I was in office.
So it's a worthwhile area for.
It's a very worthwhile area.
Pay attention to. Mr. Zeldin's been kind enough to let me go to Mr. Aspelat from New York first, and then we'll come back to Mr. Zeldin.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chairman. Violence and illicit trafficking in Latin America and the Caribbean has become a more serious problem. And I think that it deserves further attention from the U.S. I believe we need to do more with the State Department's Caribbean Basin Security Initiative and the Central American Regional Security Initiative programs to curb the persistent violence in the region. Now, previously, many of these countries sort of like transported drugs to the north, to the U.S., and they were involved in that aspect of the trade. But now there seems to also be a very dangerous and persistent code of violence in those urban cities of those countries that need to be addressed as well. And so, what are some of the recommendations that you can shed with us today, and with regards to improving the situation regarding this violence and illicit trafficking in Latin America and the Caribbean?
Just a couple of comments and ask Mr. Natsios to jump in. I think that it's clearly an issue. It's impacting us directly, whether it's because of migration and drivers there or because of the drug trade itself. I think we can look at the success of Plan Colombia for some lessons learned when we have a long-term sustained commitment. We talked about an incredibly fragile state dealing with many of those issues. Now, over 15 years later, we get to pause Colombia, and we see a different opportunity. I think the investment in the Northern Triangle of Central America, where we see a lot of those conditions, is absolutely critical to both addressing the drivers of migration, but also in countering, the cartels and the drugs that are, and the gangs in that area that are driving it. During the last administration, we made a significant increased investment there. It's a longer-term commitment that takes some time to address the violence and the corruption and the security issues, but I think that's critical to maintain.
But in addition to the sort of like traditional law enforcement efforts that could be augmented via additional funding, what are some of the social programs beyond the soccer leagues, right, that could help relieve the situation locally and also curtail the migration problem?
Yeah, what I've seen, particularly in the Northern Triangle countries, is a combination of things. You're working with law enforcement, you're doing training, you're cracking down on corruption, you're working with the three governments to ensure they're making commitments to follow through, but there's a lot of programming for kids and young people, A, to give them something to do, to keep them out of the gangs, to protect their safety. They're complicated to implement in certain very, very dangerous places, but when done well, are very successful. And I visited many of them when I was at the State Department, and I think sustaining that investment is really important, but it has to be alongside a crackdown on corruption and really focusing on law enforcement as well.
Could I just add to that? Sure. There is a part of that program, just to drill down a little further, that Heather's referring to, is an effort to look at the indices which will tell us whether a kid is vulnerable to being recruited into the gang. And so what they've done in those three countries, and this is based, by the way, on a model used in LA to keep kids out of the gangs in Los Angeles. So the deputy mayor, former deputy mayor of LA who ran those programs, is running some of the aid programs for some of the contractors now in Central America and some of the NGOs. I listened to a lecture by him. It was absolutely fascinating. So they identify what all those factors are, and then they find out which kids are vulnerable, and they put them in specific programs that reduce the vulnerability based on the factor that put them in the category in the first place. They're showing a substantial decline in gang membership as a result of that. So the programs work. But the one problem, and this is something, Mr. Chairman, that I strongly urge. I didn't say it, but and it's a failure on my part. The biggest problem with aid programming and the entire city, the executive branch and the legislative branch, the State Department, it's a problem with DOD, is the time horizon. AID programs do work. They take 10 to 15 years sometimes to work. When we have cut a program halfway through, we've just wiped out half the investment because it takes 10 years, sometimes 15 years, particularly in democracy programs, for example. We can show you that the programs work, but it takes 15 years to do it. If you cut the programs after 7 or 8 years, you just wasted all that money we invested in it. Mm-hmm. So one of the things this committee can do is just look at the time horizon problem and give aid. Now, if there's mismanagement, I'm not saying you shouldn't look at it. Absolutely. We're not talking about mismanagement. It's just if you want to show results, the Green Revolution took 30 years to implement. 30 years. I'm the chairman of a committee of the CGIR, the Consultative Group in International Agricultural Research, to breed micronutrients. It's called Harvest Plus, into zinc, iron, and vitamin A, the four largest deficiencies in micronutrients. The reason I'm bringing this up is it's going to take 30 years to do this program. We're finished for 15 years. We've bred these micronutrients into 298 crops that poor people use in the developing world. We prove this can work. Now we have to get it to seed out. It's going to take 15 years to do that. People want, the foundations tell us, the governments, we want immediate results. I said, how are you going to get the seed out to 1 billion people in a year? It takes years to do this stuff.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, just to conclude,
sure.
And these programs are obviously cost money, and this current administration continues to repeatedly send to Congress requests for deep cuts, and so that's obviously a major, major problem. That there's a perception out there that we're giving away everything, when in fact foreign aid is just minuscule with regards to the entire budget and there's proposed cuts to begin with. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I do not support these cuts, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Mr. Zelton.
USAID put forth a plan to partially reorganize lot of consultation with Congress. I don't know if you had any thoughts you wanted to share would be pertinent to the topic of this hearing with regards to the plan that USAID and Administrator Green has.
I'll just say one brief thing, because I know you'll have a lot to say. I think that there are some, it seems to be, from my perspective, some really good ideas. How they're implemented is really important. But when I look at, for example, the proposal to bring the food and nutrition programs into to stop isolating them and bring them into a more comprehensive fashion, that's just aligned with the way we do programming, for example, that we know is much more effective when it's combined with other interventions. I think there's a lot of logic there. From what I've understood from the proposals, there's still a lot to learn about its implementation.
When I was the director of OFDA, the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, which is our emergency response mechanism in AID for famines, civil wars, and disasters like earthquakes, we considered seriously merging Food for Peace and that OFDA together. If Bush 41 had been elected to a second term, we were going to implement it, but I didn't have the time to do it. We were seriously considering it. Mark Green just did it 2 weeks ago, and he asked me for support. He said, would you go with me to the Hill? This has nothing to do with the Trump administration. We were considering doing this 30 years ago. We just didn't do it. So I strongly support what Mark Green is doing. I have not, if I thought he was damaging the agency, I would say it in public. I would criticize it. He is not damaging the agency. I think he's a very good administrator. It was a good choice. He's an honorable guy who's trying to do the right thing. Now, do I agree with every single detail of everything he's doing? No. But the reorganization you're talking about, Congressman, I support. And as I said before, we were considering it in 1992.
Any other specific suggestions that you want to throw out there for our consideration and his?
I think the oversight functions, I don't want to keep going back to this, a council needs to be formed of the special IGs, the IG for AID, the OMB has investigative authority, the GAO, and the Congressional Oversight Committees. A council should be formed statutorily to meet and coordinate so they're not auditing the same program in the same country at the same time. We had 3 different agencies auditing capacity building in Iraq, and I just couldn't believe, in the middle of a war, we spent all of our time responding to 3 different agencies auditing the same program. That is a waste of taxpayer money. And it's, in my view, it was harassment. Our people are getting killed. We lost 300 people murdered in Iraq, 600 in Afghanistan. And we're in the middle of answering 3 different audits by the same 3 different agencies, the same audit and the same. Just too much. It's too much.
I'd add a couple of things that are a bit different. One, there's in the 2015 Quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Review some recommendations about how to increase efficiencies across the 2 agencies that I think, regardless of administration, this is separate from any sort of strategic priorities, I think are important. One of them that I led was a joint strategic planning exercise across the 2 agencies. That doesn't happen anymore, as well as joint reviews. And the reason for that, there's some tension, of course, between what development priorities and what foreign policy or diplomatic priorities we might have in certain places. But the fact of coordinating and communicating and collaborating is just a more efficient use of our dollars. And it doesn't subjugate one department's priorities to the other. It's really about coordination and making sure in Washington we have the same level of understanding that you might have in a mission or in an embassy, which isn't always the case. And also I'd say, Mr. Nazio said something earlier about empowering the field. One very practical thing, when the State Department begins its budget and planning process, it starts at the mission and it comes up to the bureaus, then eventually at USAID it's the other way. And I think there's a lot of inefficiency in having those processes sort of start in different places and end up differently. They need to be separate processes, but they should be better aligned.
We used to do planning at the mission level, but because every single dollar is earmarked in AID, we have to tell the missions these are the earmarks that they're going to get imposed on us, and you need to plan based on what we know is going to happen. The old system for 40 years in aid was everything was done from the bottom up. I said this doesn't make any sense because everything's earmarked. There's no discretion left.
Briefly, we just have just over a minute left. Switching over to the State Department and the special envoy positions, Secretary Tillerson was starting to look at the 6 or so special envoys. Are there any that you've identified as wanting to elevate higher? Are there any positions, any of the special envoy positions that you think are unnecessary? Do you have any thoughts that you want to share?
I think from from a process perspective, I think there should be a regular, and I would do it every 1 or 2 year review of the special envoy offices. Many are congressionally mandated. Others are appointed because at a moment in time you need them, and those are important, and we shouldn't say all special envoys are bad, in my opinion, but some are outdated, and it's not a great use of resources. We did that under Secretary Kerry's leadership, and we got rid of a bunch. It wasn't the most popular thing within the building, but it was the way that we could then say we need a special envoy to counter ISIL or another strategic priority. So I think it's an important regular process that should occur in the State Department. In terms of currently, I don't think I'm as familiar with the current specter, but I think they should be regularly reviewed and they should be presented to Congress as well.
I was special envoy myself for President Bush for Sudan. And needless to say, I think I did a pretty good job under difficult circumstances in the middle of 2 terrible civil wars. But we have to understand the effect it has on the assistant secretaries when we put special envoys in to do their job, because that's what's happening. Now, are there situations where you need a special envoy for a major crisis that you have to spend all your time on? Yes, there is. And I think I agree with Heather, saying all special envoys are a bad idea is not wise. However, having 50 special envoys, to me, why do you have a State Department then? Why are there assistant secretaries? What are they left to do? So I know it's very difficult from a political standpoint to get rid of some of these titles. They're apple pie and motherhood. But from a management standpoint, it doesn't make any sense.
Well, my time's up. I'll yield back to the chair.
Thank you. And in line with some of the things that sometimes doesn't make any sense, Ms. Higginbottom, it seems that sometimes our humanitarian goals are undercut by other parts of U.S. foreign policy. To me, there seems to be an emblematic example is the horrific situation that's happening in Yemen. Money for humanitarian aid doesn't seem to be a problem. We've sent over $700 million trying to alleviate the enormous human suffering that is taking place in Yemen. But it cannot get to the people because of the political and the military realities there. And one of those realities is that under the Obama and Trump administration, we have been militarily supporting the Saudi-led coalition. I was proud to co-sponsor the Yemen War Powers Resolution, and my question to you is to kind of think about the big picture. Is it the case that our diplomacy and development objectives sometimes seem to severely undercut our military and political objectives?
Thank you, Congresswoman. I mean, the humanitarian situation in Yemen is just awful. It's one of the worst crises, obviously, in the world. There's 80% of the Yemeni population that is in need of humanitarian assistance. We have a very large program with CARE trying to address some of those needs. I can speak to my perspective from the Obama administration, in which we were deeply engaged in trying to support a political solution, a peace solution, and had quite a deep involvement in that, which is ultimately how we're going to reduce the violence. And I think that diplomacy and engaging in that is critically important. Obviously, you know, we find ourselves facing just an absolutely horrific crisis there, and we've got to figure out what are the steps forward now.
If I could just add something.
Yeah, I actually was going to have you answer this question for me. Would you explain why a focus on humanitarian aid and human rights and development are important from a national security standpoint?
Sometimes there is a conflict, Congresswoman. I watched it. I would get enraged sometimes when you have fights, sometimes yelling matches. But this has been going on for 70 years. It's not new. Sometimes it's more public than it was. food was used as a weapon against North Korea during the nuclear negotiations 25 years ago when the famine was going on and 2.5 million people died. And I was in the NGO community. I was vice president of World Vision, and we had a coalition to stop using food as a weapon in diplomacy. President Bush said we will never do, and he didn't. For 8 years he was president. I don't think President Obama did it while he was in office. So there are clear tensions, and you have to make a judgment as to what is most important and whether it's appropriate to use. I mean, for me, using food aid as a weapon in negotiations is like blaming the people who've been the object of atrocities for the atrocity. They're not the ones that committed the problem. The people who are dying in a famine are usually weak, vulnerable people who have no way of protecting themselves. Why are we punishing them? So I don't think sometimes we consider the ethical consequences of what we're doing. But let me just tell, with respect to Yemen, I wrote an op-ed piece with the former director of OFDA, the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, in the Obama administration. It was a bipartisan op-ed criticizing the Saudi government's, what do they call it when they prevent food from going in? The what? The blockade of Yemen. I'm sorry, I'm having an elderly moment here. We timed it so when the Saudi prime minister was visiting, he apparently got a little upset that it appeared in the newspaper when he arrived. Yeah. And then President Trump actually issued a tweet attacking the Saudis for doing this. And they suspended the blockade for a few months, but then they reimposed it. So, I mean, reimposing it, that doesn't work. Mm-hmm. For me, you have to consider the ethical consequences of this.
So we're in agreement that humanitarian aid should never be politicized.
I don't think it should be politicized, and I've spent 30 years of my career trying to prevent that from happening.
I agree with that.
I appreciate that. I yield back my time.
Mr. Sheldon, if you don't have any additional questions.
Now, let me just add one little qualification.
Please.
If we find out that the food is being diverted by the regime, then you have to stop the program. And that's what we found, that the North Koreans were diverting food. I sent someone up undercover to the Chinese border with North Korea, interviewing refugees, and we found out 40 to 60% of the food was being diverted by the secret police and the military, and I said, the program's ending. We did it very quietly because it wasn't going to the people who were supposed to get it. That is a legitimate reason for ending it. That's not politicizing the aid. The purpose of the aid is to feed poor people.
And part of our job is oversight,
yes,
is to make sure our aid and humanitarian efforts are getting to the folks that we are actually
exactly
trying to help.
Exactly.
Sure, go ahead.
Can you think of an example where a country that we might send humanitarian aid into can see it as inciting violence within that country?
Well, most of the, I mean, if you talk to Omar al-Bashir, who I've dealt with for 30 years, and the president of Sudan, he'll maybe leaving office shortly, involuntarily, given the uprising going on in northern Sudan right now. And he saw all of the humanitarian aid as helping his opponents and prolonging the war. He said, if you only stop the aid, you know, all these people would stop fighting. I said, well, they'll stop fighting because they'll all be dead. That's what you want to happen. No, Andrew, you're just keeping the war going on. So I didn't take him, I understood what he was saying, and he did argue that some of the food was being diverted, and we had to be careful not to have that happen, to get to the rebels, for example, in Darfur. But 2 million people's villages were burned down, 3,800 villages by the Janjaweed in cooperation with the Sudanese government. We're supposed to just ignore that? 300,000 people died in Darfur.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I think we're in agreement that sometimes in particular situations, depending on who is looking at it, sometimes we can see it as being diverted, and we can have a moral clarity and an ethical understanding of why we're doing it. And sometimes people within those nations can look at it as having an alternative motive in getting involved and sending that aid. And so there is a balance And oftentimes, we have to be cautious of towing the line and making sure that we are not being seen as bad actors intervening in other people's affairs. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to thank both of the witnesses for being here. We'll get you to your plane on time. And,
Thank you, Carter.
And again, we look forward to continuing to work with both your organizations and both of you as well. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
With that, I adjourn.